Hi, I am Dr. Richard Camino. I am training director for the Medical College of Georgia in the program of psychiatry. And all of us has gone through very difficult times in COVID and also in this movement about understanding where bias and racism is in our society. So we have prepared for you with Dr. Lisa Fortuna, our co-chair in the Committee of Religion and Spirituality, and Jonathan Shepard, this program called Religion and the African American Experience, Oppression and Liberation, Times of Hardship and Resistance. We are going to start by saying that, at least for me, I'm an active member of the United Methodist Church, and I have no other disclosures to present. I think it's important to put this within the ACAP mission. The mission of ACAP is the promotion of the healthy development of children, adolescents, and their families through advocacy, education, research, and to meet the professional needs of child and adolescent psychiatrists throughout their careers. And I think that this program meets clearly those values and missions. We have 5 objectives today. And they're going to be shared by all of us. I am going to discuss the first 4 and the other 5 inlaid with the other objectives that we have here are going to be discussed by Jonathan and Lisa. We're going to present an historical overview of how and what way religion and spirituality was influential in the lives of African American slave communities in the United States up to the Civil War and after. Provide awareness that although most African slaves were converted to Christianity, 10% of those slaves arrived at the US as Muslims. And African religion was an important part of their faith base and how many of them translated those into Christian practices. Make the case of how religion became an instrument of oppression. So we are clear, all of us, that religion can be an instrument of oppression, but also of hope, resilience, and liberation. I'm going to present a very brief scheme of the moral foundation theory and how we can use it as a tool to approach bias and racism. And we're going to explore the spiritual and religious and psychological implications for use of color, especially in times of hardship and resistance. Every world faith has condoned some form of version of servitude in its time, including the atheist creed of communism by historian Clarence Smith state that to us. Historical notes on the African journey include that there were 20 million Africans captured for slave trade. More than half of them died before reaching the coast of Africa. About 10 to 12 million Africans were sold in slavery from Africa to Europe. Between 1 and 2 million slave individuals died during the shipment in the New World. And there were 500,096, 751 slave imports. And why do we know this precisely? Because they were treated, remember, as possessions, as inventory. So that's why we have so many specific and appropriate numbers for that up till 1870. Slavery. How did that slavery from the 16th to 19th century came to about, especially in the New World? Well, slavery emerges from the scarcity of labor and the abundance of land in the Americas. First, sugarcane, and then cotton, specifically with the advent of the cotton gin. It takes a culture that sees certain human beings as property or livestock or things for labor to be structured in those particular ways. And religion had a profound effect in the way that this was justified in those years. European views of slavery in the 16th century, most did not think of slavery as a moral issue. And they used, Greek history and Roman history as an example of that. European societies were already organizing hierarchies. And remember that in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, we just has come from the medieval, being a servant it was a part of the everyday life. Greed, racial prejudice, and the conviction that Africans live in ignorance and misery combined to justify and excuse making slaves. Christianity was mentioned by many that, God, they said, intended for some men to rule over others. Slavery offered an opportunity to convert thousands. If anyone questioned slavery, the answers lay ready to hand. The slave that Africans owned, traders could persuade themselves that they were merely moving, Africans from one master to another. And I'm going to mention Reverend Thornton Stringfellow because he was a very important advocate for slavery. And this is a great example of how religion can be an instrument of oppression. And I'm going to quote, "The Old Testament and the New sanction slavery, but no other circumstance enjoy its abolition. Even among saints, masters have been left by the Almighty, both under the patriarchal, legal, and God dispensation to their individual discretion of the subjects. In their bondage here on earth, they have been much better, with great multitudes of them having made freemen of the Lord Jesus Christ." So basically, Thornton and Stringfellow say, we're doing them a favor. We're doing them a favor, and left these words rejoicing in hope of glory in God. And reader, bear in mind, as if to rebuke the doctrine of abolition, servants are not only inventory as property, but they are the property which God has given to Abraham. So those are the basis of the moral view of slavery. The Virginia General Assembly in 1705 stated, "All servants imported and brought into the country who were not Christians in their countries shall be accounted to be a slave. All Negro, mulatto, and Indians slaves." So it's important to understand that the first slaves in the New World or in the Americas were Native Americans, not Negro and not mulatto, Native Americans. And they will be held to be real estate. That's why we have so good accountability of a lot of things that happened, because they were just in the inventory. So how is religion also a beacon of hope and strength when it has been used as a way to oppress others? Well, this is a quote from Charles Bell, and he states that I knew several people who must have been from what I've seen and learned, Mohammedans, Muslims. Though at that time, I've never heard of the religion of Muhammad. There was one man on this plantation who prayed 5 times every day, always turning his face to the east in the performance of his devotion. So in this statement of Charles Ball, one of the things is that this is a person that went from slavery to be free, and religion served this person as a way to endure, to withstand the horrendous treatment of slave. Muslims, enslaved Muslims use their faith as a bilingual literal literacy to build community, resist slavery, and pursue freedom. They also wrote pages in Arabic for their slaveholders and their friends. But instead of writing what the recipients thought, what the slaveholders thought was Bible verses or the Lord's Prayer, they wrote Quranic verses that condemned slavery and made genealogical lists and even pleaded a return to home. So this was, something that was important to them. African religions also was a source of hope and determinations. Africans pursue their own religions as an attitude of defiance. You might have my body, but you will not have my soul. Many slave Africans embraced religion rituals as an act of self-determination. African religions provided the basis for armed revolt among slaves. Akan speakers in the 18th century in Antigua and Jamaica were part of the product of the Haitian Revolution, and the Hausana Yoruba Muslims of Bahia in the 19th century culminated in the Malay Revolt of 1835. Nat Turner, a Christian, appropriated the Exodus and the Moses liberation of the Hebrews as his call and source of illumination for his revolt, although this was ended and they were all killed after he started his revolt. We want to hear directly from the slaves, and these are photographs from former slaves, and they were talking, for example, white folks feared for neighbors to get any religion and education, but I reckon something inside just told us about God and that there was a better place hereafter, bringing hope. We can pray by ourselves, and we daren't let white folks know about it. And Jenny Proctor stated, there wasn't no church for the slave, but we go to the white folks' arbor on Sunday evening. Here we're confronted with Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush was the father of psychiatry. He was the emblem of the American Psychiatric Association until recently, and was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And in 1787, he joined the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. He helped found the city's first Black church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he became president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. So with somebody with such what it seems to be a clear moral compass, then you ask yourself, how can, for example, he brought a slave, and he had the slave even as he was the leader of the abolitionist movement. And he freed the slave, not for free. I mean, William Gruber had to pay him to get in 1794 to be free. He thought that leprosy caused blackness in the skin, and that's why we have African Americans. Why did he thought that? Because he has this view that literally the Genesis said something about Adam and Eve. So if we all are Adam and Eve, and clearly Adam and Eve were white, well, how they can have become, dark skin? Well, it might have been an illness. And he believed that a cure would change an African skin color from black to white. And this is the founder of psychiatry in the US. Again, what it seems to be a great moral compass, but tremendous inconsistencies in his worldview. So how can we understand that? How can we, look at people that seem to be good, that are religious, even pious people, have such great moral contradictions? So that gets us to a little bit about moral development, which we all learn from Piaget, from Cormer, and from Gilligan. But one of the things is that right now, Piaget and Colbert thought that moral development was an aspect of logic and thought, had to do with reasoning. Gilligan challenged that, and she thought that there were issues that had to do with caring, that are beyond. So this has been our new findings in evolutionary psychology has started to look at the moral paradigm differently, how attachment influences our moral values, how intuitions or emotions also take account to that, how temperament has to do with that, how then, the epigenetics of this, family, culture, religious values, and the cognitive development, how they all form. So this is not one or the other, this is an amalgamation of all those aspects. So I am going to bring to you one of the contemporary theories right now, and it's not the only one, so I think it's important to say, but I am using it as a practical way to understand some things. So what moral foundation theory tells us is that moral judgment is an intuitive affair. So it starts really emotionally. It's an automatic aspect of us, and it's not really a rational process. Reason comes after the emotion of the first judgment appears, and then it might or might not be verified, or the reason is just used to justify that moral component. So there's 6 areas. You know, it depends. Some people say 5, 6. I'm just going to mention this here, that the foundations are caring for others, treating and being fair to others, feeling free or liberty, loyalty to the group or a cause, respect and submit to authority, and pursuing purity and sanctity. You ask, where did they get all those, you know, domains? This has been done through the studies of other species, not human beings. For example, there are good studies done in capuchin monkeys and other primates, that they have a strong sense of fairness. And when you treat one different from the other, there is anger and there is a sense of unfairness treated for others. So this domain are not domains that are just, you know, somebody thought that this would be good domains. They seem, or at least they've been brought from the areas of evolutionary psychology. So look at what we have here. So let's look at care, fairness, liberty, authority, loyalty. Those who tend to be more liberal, the aspects of care, fairness, and liberty are stronger. And although authority, loyalty, and aspects of purity also are part of their moral compass, they don't have the strength of the first 3 that I mentioned. But when you look at conservative, the aspects of caring for others, being loyal, responding to authority, liberty, fairness, and purity, they have more or less equal value. So this starts to make an explanation of what we are seeing. For example, look here, care has to do with wrong, you know, hurting people, and how this, you know, is can release suffering, how justice, fairness, and reciprocity deals with issues of fairness, in-group loyalty, you know, so I am worried about other threats, other people, other things going from the outside in, so I have to defend my group. I have to protect my group. Purity and sanctity, issues of virtue. Who is the virtual person in our midst? So in data collected from 996 people, how is this applied? So they look at prejudice and welcoming attitudes towards Syrian refugees. And they looked this in 996 adults in the United States. This was done in 2016. And they found that cultural humility was correlated positive to immigration. And where did that cultural humility came from? From the foundations of careness and fairness. The reverse was also positive in this study. They found that prejudicial attitudes were there because they perceived real threat, symbolic threat, and the moral foundations of loyalty to my group, responding to what I believe are my authority, be the Bible, be my religion, be my pastor, be whoever. I need to obey and respond to that. And the aspects of purity, them versus me, were significantly increased when they were compared to those who were more culturally sensitive. So we can see here how the moral compass can be difficult to put into words, just and this type of theory and foundation help us to look at this better. So finally, I want to finish with this. This is a photo that I took while I was in the West Bank. This is in Bethlehem, that is part of the West Bank. And, I was so impressed by this mural. So you see somebody that seems to be fighting the establishment or fighting what they believe is their moral duty. But what they have in their hands, it's a flowers, you know. So how we respond to what is unfair and unjust is as important of responding to what is unfair and unjust. So I want to stop here my part, and I want to welcome Jonathan Shepard, and he will continue to our discussion today with us.
All right, greetings everyone, and thank you, Richard. I appreciate how you have laid the foundation for our important discussion that we're having. I also want to thank Lisa and both of them inviting me to join in this conversation about faith, religion, spirituality, and the Black community. I look forward to the things I will share with you. I plan to be the bridge between Richard and Lisa on this particular discussion. And so I look forward to jumping right on in, passionate about this topic. So one disclosure, I am proudly an ordained elder in the Church of God in Christ, Inc. And just two objectives today: discuss the impact of religion and spirituality on the well-being of the Black Americans, and then briefly explore the impact of the Black church on the civil rights movement within the United States of America. So here are just a couple of facts that I want to highlight today. Facts about the religious lives of Black Americans. And these facts can be found in the Pew Research Center study, the 2014 U.S. Religious Landscape Study, and some important things to recognize about Black Americans, because as you are treating them, we have to remember that we are speaking to our patients, and many of us have patients who are African American or of African descent, and so it's important to understand where religion fits into their lives. So the first point is 8 in 10 Blacks or Black Americans identify themselves as Christian. And you would find most Blacks attending large, historically Black churches. Some of those are noted there: the National Baptist Convention, USA, the Church of God in Christ, which I am proudly a member of. Both sides of my family are a part of that, my mom's side and dad's side. And then the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Those are just a couple of the large historically Black churches that exist in our country. Blacks are more religious by measures of commitment, according to this study. 3/4 of Black Americans say that religion is very important in their lives. So it's something that must be taken into account as you are working with the African American family. Blacks also attend church at least once a week and pray regularly. This is part of their commitment to their religion. And then more are likely to say that they believe in God with absolute certainty. Here are some national trends to keep in mind. Younger Blacks, maybe millennials in particular, and even younger, are more likely to be religiously unaffiliated, whereas with the older Blacks tend to be more associated with a historically Black church. Important facts to remember as you are in treating your African American family and patient. Mental health, faith, religion, spirituality, and mental health. All right. The definition of mental health, as you see there, is a state of well-being where every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her own community. That is by the World Health Organization. This definition is so significant and significant to this particular discussion because it ties into religion, faith, and spirituality. You might say, well, how does that work, Dr. Shepard? Well, individuals' faith, religion, and spirituality should speak to those 4 facets of mental health. And so I have broken those down into an acronym that I call PCWC. So I want to ask yourself, and you should ask your family and ask your African-American family and patient, how is your PCWC? And how does your faith fuel your PCWC? Again, PCWC stands for potential, cope, work, and contribution. So that is what makes up mental health. So a person's religion, faith, and spirituality should bolster those 4 aspects of an individual's mental health. Let me go through each one quickly. So that first letter P, potential. Your faith, religion, spirituality speaks to the untapped skills and possibilities that lie within you. That's why it's so important to the life of an African-American to have religion, because, or faith or spirituality, and really everyone, in particular, we're just talking about Blacks today, but it speaks to the potential that lies within that person. The next letter is C, cope. Increase our ability to overcome problems and difficulties with success. So if you are a person who is a part of a religion, it speaks to your potential, and then it speaks to your ability to cope. And during this time and pandemic, we need both to remember our potential and remember that we can cope with what we're going through. The next letter is W, work. To function or operate according to plan or design. And the last letter is C, contribution. To play a significant part in bringing about an end or result. So with those definitions right there of PCWC, you see how faith, religion, spirituality is so important to a person's mental health. So that's why people have struggled, and even yourself may have struggled when you were unable to be able to gather together, especially for Black Americans, be able to gather together, because that place where they can exercise their faith, exercise their religion, showcase their spirituality, has now hampered their ability to show forth their potential, their ability to cope, their ability to work, and their ability to make a contribution to his or her community. So through faith and religion, Blacks practice PCWC. Moving along here. So now that we understand what the connection is between mental health and faith, religion, and spirituality is, let's talk about the role of the Black church and the civil rights movement. Many movements for equality were birthed out of religious faith. Let's look at some examples. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most noted examples, who was a Baptist minister. Let's look at John Lewis, who was also a Baptist minister. And for this presentation, I chose to focus a little bit more on Congressman John Lewis, since he just recently died in July of 2020. And I want to just focus on how he played such a significant role in the civil rights movement, but how he got to that point. And this is really interesting for you to note, not just because we're taking a little trip down memory lane, but it's important to understand how the Black church plays such an important part in the mental health, we just talked about that, but also in discovering the purpose of that particular person's reason on being on earth. So John Lewis, he would emulate the preachers and ministers who led members of the Black community, because there were no Black political leaders at that time to serve as role models. So the role models were the Black preachers and ministers. He wanted to emulate the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. by becoming a minister. This is John Lewis who we're talking about. He enrolled in the American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee. and learned about nonviolent protests through the Nashville Christian Leadership Conference and Mahatma Gandhi. He viewed civil rights activism as an extension of faith rooted in stories about Jesus and the words of Gandhi. Here is a direct quote of John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis. In my estimation, the civil rights movement was a religious phenomenon. When we go to sit in or go to march, I felt and I really believe that there was a force in front of us and a force behind us, because sometimes you didn't know what to do. You didn't know what to say. You didn't know how you were going to make it through the day or through the night. But somehow, in some way, you believed, you had faith that it all was going to be all right. So looking at his life, it really demonstrated to me the importance of mentorship and its influence on another's faith and religion. That connection between John Lewis and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is played out even today. When you are taking care of Black American young boys, young girls, many of them are being mentored by people within their congregation, by people within their religious community. You have to take note of that. You need to be aware where a lot of them are receiving their teachings and learnings from, because that helps to give you an aspect and view of why they may react or respond to certain things that are occurring in their lives. So that importance of mentorship cannot be stressed enough. Now, let's look at, as I am bringing this to a close, let's look at the impact of the Black church and the civil rights movement. So with that stated, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Congressman John Lewis, they were leaders of the civil rights movement. And one thing about the civil rights movement, it was a nonviolent time. Yes, violence did occur, but most of the protests that were led by these leaders were non-violent protests. And that's important to note, because the Black church believed in non-violent protests. And still to this day, we may not see as much of it, but they still believe to this day non-violent protests. So let me give you some examples of that. The Black church was part of the leadership of the nonviolent protests. Let's take, for example, the Freedom Rides of 1961. This first movement of the 1960s to provide an opportunity for nonviolent participation on a national level, to allow movement activities to come together in a single action that led them to jail and unmerited suffering. And some would even say that it related to the scripture in New Testament of Acts chapter 16, verse 25, with Paul and Silas and how they were jailed for spreading the gospel. And they were doing it non-violently. And so many of the leaders of this particular type of protests, the Freedom Rides, they were religious leaders, and they saw themselves as Paul and Silas being locked up in jail. So they didn't mind going to jail because they had read about Paul and Silas and others who had been jailed for bringing about freedom. And their freedom was, again, asking for equality. And then to go further with the Freedom Rides, people of faith from all over the nation joined the Freedom Rides and brought segregation in interstate travel to a halt by the end of 1961. This victory brought new strength to the struggle for freedom and justice, and the climate for social change began to shift in the years that followed. That's important, that from that non-violent protest, they were able to shift the climate. And if we want to relate to 2020, there is a climate shift even occurring now as we see the examples, and I know Lisa's going to get into this, of the nonviolent protests that are occurring. There's one other one that I must mention that many people know, famously known, the March on Washington in 1963. It actually occurred in August of 1963. The March on Washington was the largest mass protest for civil rights in this nation's history. People of faith were represented in large numbers at this momentous gathering. Now, again, we're celebrating and talking about the Black church, but everybody was not happy about the power of the Black church. So we had white supremacist opposition. They even were aware of the power of the church in relation to the movement's resources, the economic, the social, political, and educational, as well as the spiritual power of the movement was embodied in the Black church. The church served as a symbol of the civil rights movement. It represented the freedom that the movement participants sought. It was a facility in the community beyond the control of the white power structure. It was a place where people could speak the truth, where they could sing or even shout, as Richard talked about, as those slaves that he had come to the microphone, if you would, and speak about their experience. But with this all said, fear set in. And those militant defenders of the status quo, which was white supremacy, reacted with fierce repressive measures, targeting the source of the power that was pressing for change. Herein lies the struggle that we still face today in the 21st century. That's where I will stop. I am the bridge. And so it's my pleasure to now turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Fortuna.
Right, so thank you, Richard and Jonathan. I'm Lisa Fortuna, Associate Professor, Vice Chair at University of California in San Francisco, and great pleasure to join my colleagues in this discussion today. I'm going to focus on spirituality and resistance in times of hardship and looking a little closer at the Black Lives Matter and the impact on Black youth mental health in a contemporary perspective. Disclosures: I am a clergy person in the Episcopal Church, USA. So some of my objectives for this segment is to describe how religion and spirituality can be an instrument for resilience and liberation for Black youth. Look at the Black Lives Matter movement as an example of spirituality used as healing and as resistance. Consider some of the psychological implications of religion and spirituality for youth of color, especially regarding coping with racism and related trauma. And consider implications for assessing spiritual, cultural, racial identity in practice. I start with this, this quote or this concept from Cheryl Sanders, who is a faculty at the Berkeley program that looks at theology and action. And she talks about God and reflections on history, theology, and hope amid the flames of outrage, even in the contemporary issues that we're having now. And she says that really we need to look at a balanced view of our current situation that looks at Black suffering, the history of Black suffering, which we've been talking about today in part, and also Black achievement. And that religious leaders and scholars really have an important role to look at that complexity of the African American narrative as told from the vantage point of religion and spirituality. And this is just a photo from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I recommend everyone to go to their website and to go to their museum once we can do that. We really get a good concept of this historical perspective of religion and spirituality in the civil rights movement, as we just talked about, in other movements. And one of the things, I mean, we see Martin Luther King and others here. one of the things I just wanted to point with this picture is that youth and young people and young adults have often and usually been part of national movements around racial equity and civil rights, and have taken great risks, including incarceration, and even harm to their bodies. Even when we think about John Lewis, in that role. And spirituality and religion are part of what fuel the energy and the capacity to do those things. The influence and involvement of Black religious leaders in the civil rights movement in the US is well noted. We've talked a little bit about that today. And also that is along with the Nation of Islam, and also the importance of discussing faith-based involvement in the Black civil rights movement, though, however, tends to focus a little bit more exclusively on the male perspective and heteronormative. And what we're seeing in some of the newer movements, like Black Lives Matter and the work of Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of the movement, expands the definition of faith-based and offers alternative notions of faith, which include self-care, wellness, and resistance, and healing for those within traumatized communities. And there are quite a few theologies that we can point to that have influenced these movements. It's not monolithic. Even as we're looking at justice for George Floyd, there are all kinds of theologies that come into place. Black and people of color have had multiple theologies, including womanist theology, which focuses on the theologies from a perspective of women of color. Mujerista is one that is in the Latino context in that regard. The Poor People's Campaign is also another movement that is really looking for a call for moral revival and looking at issues of poverty and economic justice in a religious faith perspective. You know, all pulling from different Christian heritages and perspectives on the role of Christianity in multiple faiths in social justice and the care for the most vulnerable and the rights of the poor, and including Gandhi here and his influence, and Martin Luther King and many other leaders, as we've been talking about. So it really is quite a diverse perspective of communities of color, women, and more even queer folks in terms of queer theology. And so all of these are coming into play in a lot of the current movements. Some people thought the Black Lives Matter movement had apathy for organized religion, but the movement actually does have spiritual roots. And in that movement, many activists want to explore their ancestors' African spirituality. And also Black churches and mainline Protestants are still continuing to influence the movement. It's not uncommon for Black Lives Matter meetings to begin with things coming from Black African heritage of spirituality, of pouring up of a libation, a ritual rooted in African spirituality where participants pour out a sacrificial liquid offering to give homage to ancestors and call on their names to invoke their presence and their wisdom and help. And the names of faith-oriented activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Harriet Tubman can make the top of that list. And here's sort of just an example where we, call up George Floyd, Ashe, Philando Castile, Ashe, using this term Ashe, which is a Yoruba word, generally defined as the power to make things happen. It refers to the spiritual life force that flows through things. So it's bringing those things into action and life. And these include ancestors and those lost. Harriet Tubman, Ashe, Malcolm X, Ashe, Martin Luther King, Ashe. And Patrisse, one of the founders and leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, often starts with a prayer in events. And this is just one example of one of her prayers she did on May 8th. And you can see some of the language again about thinking about the history and the ancestors and healing. This one about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. They hunted you like they hunted our ancestors and our ancestors' ancestors. And so they prayed. And this is prayer that I have is for you, Ahmaud. And she goes on in talking about the importance of collective prayer that is grounded in the idea and the belief that one day we will be free. And she ends it, I know we will be free. I can feel it, I can smell it, I can see it. Heba Farag, Assistant Director of Research at the University of California Center for Religion and Civic Culture, talks about this. It's just a different and newer faith. The fight for Black liberation has always been a faith movement, and that's what we've been talking about today. And Black Lives Matter is no different. They're also faith infused. And there also is this concept of the movement of Black Lives is working towards a goal of not just racial justice, but freedom of the mind and the spirit. And there's this concept of encouraging healing justice, which is a framework to mean our collective and individual capacity to hold, to respond to intervene, to transform struggle and grief, while still staying rooted in who we are, in identity, where we come from, and how we envision our future. And this is some of the orientation to religion and spirituality that we see has been present, but definitely reemerging in the death of George Floyd, which impacted so many people in the heart of what is wrong in this country and in that suffering, and the sort of re-emergence and strengthening of this concept of healing justice and racial justice together. Patrice Culler says, the fight to save your life is a spiritual fight. There are many spiritualities that further repress and subjugate people in their communities. But what she talks about is calling for spirituality that's deeply radical in its ability to heal people. I don't think we're people to be fixed, but rather how do we hold faith for people who have had harm caused them in a way that makes them feel like they have agency again. That's what spirituality has the ability to do. And we see some of these concepts of religion and spirituality as having the opportunity to heal and to protect in even our scientific literature. In this article, which was titled, Can I Live? Black American Adolescent Boys Report of Police Abuse and the Role of Religiosity in Mental Health, was really looking at Black males anticipating and preparing for involuntary police contact, which unfortunately is inevitable part of life for these young men. And they examine the impact of the reports of police abuse on mental health, the protective role of religiosity among a nationally represented sample of Black American adolescent boys. And as you can imagine, they found that reports of police abuse was associated with a belief that society views Black American lives less favorably, that Black lives are not as important. But higher reports of subjective religiosity, and subjective in the terms of connection with religious spiritual traditions and being connected to that, were associated with lower depressive symptoms, even with the concurrent understanding that Black American lives may not be as respected. That the subjective religiosity was protective, even given that, in terms of developing depression. And in terms of social support, another study here, which looked at religious social support and discrimination and psychiatric disorders among Black adolescents, found that Black adolescents who experience discrimination are also most likely to meet criteria for a psychiatric disorder, which we would understand. But again, those who report experience religious social support, now religiosity in the sense of community and support, are less likely to meet criteria for psychiatric disorder. And this has been found in multiple studies of the protective impact of faith. And so Barack Obama recently was looking at sort of the spirituality and the frameworks that so many youth are employing these days around racial justice, and talking about how to make this moment the turning point for real change. with a new generation of activists. And some of the things that he pointed out is that the radical resistance strategies that young people are employing now are not new, and we've talked about some of those historically, but instead they built upon a long history of Black freedom struggle. They're the sort of continuity of that struggle. But then he also says we can learn from this new generation who address racial injustice issues. We can learn about how they deliberately push against toxic power arrangements, against hierarchy, patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, even in the context of religion and spirituality, and that these activists cut against the grain of traditional religious leadership and organizing. And even though we know that a lot of younger people may not be as much a member of traditional Black churches or other organized religion, even though they still are, there is still this religious spiritual movement in these racial justice struggles. And here are just some examples of sort of confronting racism in faith, another world is possible, bad faith, and anti-Black racism. So one of my recommendations in terms of how we can look at this from child and adolescent psychiatrists and in the field is there is already this acronym of HOPE, which are questions that approach a spiritual assessment. And I want to sort of reinforce this idea of listening for hope. It says H, the source of hope. Where does a young person you're working with find meaning, comfort, strength, peace, love, connection? And by focusing on a patient's basic spiritual resources, we start to, without introducing the words religion or spirituality necessarily from the start, you can at least start exploring these conversations with them about a wide variety of their backgrounds and beliefs, where they find, again, this meaning, comfort, strength, peace, love, and connection. And if they are involved in organized religions, what is the role for the young person? What are their personal spiritualities and practices and beliefs that move them, that support them? What are the effects of the young person's beliefs and values on meaning making, decision, coping, and even action in the context that we are all encountering even today? So why does religion and spirituality matter? It relates to well-being. It has historical political context for Black youth and youth of color and this country. Religious spiritual heritage and racial justice movements is part of the context of many Black youth and families in this country. And it offers us an opportunity to understand more about racial trauma, opportunities for action and healing, especially in the current context of events and movements. And it underlines for us the importance of knowing thy history. And then I just close here with a sign, really, where young people, one young person wrote, "Before I die, I want to be free, be treated with equality, seen as a human, the change I want to see." And really, a lot of the spirituality and religiosity infusion is really around having those desires, those wants, those beliefs, those values.
All right, so thank you. We just heard excellent presentations, and we just want to ask a couple questions to the discussants. And so the first question is, how have you been able to apply the principles discussed in our presentations in your practice and or ministry? Richard, you want to go first?
Yes. So, for example, I have used the Moral Foundation theory. There's a questionnaire, and it's called the Moral Foundation questionnaire. So I have given that to parents as a clinical tool. And what I have found is that when the issues of care and fairness ally very highly with loyalty, with the issue of responding to authority, that these are very important issues. I found that they have a little bit more conflict with, for example, with if their son or daughter is LGBT, which is one of the reasons that I have used it. And what I have been able to do is sit down with the parents and use the questionnaire in a way of, I understand that from a religious point of view, from your moral point of view, the issues of obeying what you feel that your church says is important. Uh, but how do you align that with caring for your child? How do you align that knowing that discriminating or not accepting or not understanding what your child is going through is going to have very harmful implications? So I go into the literature, I explain them, how high risk LGBT persons, when they are in a family that they feel they're rejected to them, or they feel that they're in a community that is not accepting for them, they are at higher risk of having bad consequences in them. So that helps us to start a dialogue. And in my experience, most of the time it promotes an understanding, and they don't feel that they have to claudicate from what they think is their moral conviction, but understanding care, worrying about my child is my most important duty here. And that's the way that I have used moral foundation, for example, in my clinical practice.
Lisa?
So, yeah, I really use this idea of the hope questions in clinical practice, because it's interesting. I've worked with young people in both ministry, where we can more directly go into thinking about faith, and versus my clinical situations, where I try to ask a little bit more open-ended questions about how people have coped in meaning making, that then goes into some conversations about where spirituality and faith may go into that. And one story that pops into mind is a young man that actually was from Central America and had experienced a lot of oppression for being an LGBT youth, actually, in Honduras, and also nonetheless was being also pushed into being in gangs, which he continuously refused, and almost lost his life on several occasions, where they actually put guns to his head in trying to make him do different things that he refused to do, that were violent. And as I was listening to this young man's story, which in some ways may seem very particular in terms of an immigrant context, but I've heard so many other stories about young people, even in our urban context and everything, sort of resisting and trying to sort of survive through very challenging circumstances. I asked him, how did you make it through? What were the things that kept you steadfast in your decisions about what you were going to do or not do to harm other people? And he very, because, he had also sort of integrated this idea that he wanted to be a lawyer to help the poor. And he basically said, it's my faith, right? I believe in a Jesus Christ that came to this world to make a new day and to walk and to support the poor. And how can I say that is true and yet oppress and kill the poor, right? And I think Christ walks with me in making these decisions, and to that I will stay steadfast until I die, because there's no other life but that. And so even though this young man had PTSD, we were able to sort of talk about where he found that enduring strength in his faith and in his actions and in the goodness of that. And that was very important to his healing. And I think for a lot of young people, looking at that goodness and where they sort of take that heritage forward is important around meaning making and connection. So that's just one example.
And Jonathan, I really like what you brought to the table in the sense of the potential cope work and contribution. How have you used that in your clinical practice because I think that those concepts can be so practical. So give us an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for asking that question, because that has really been the essence of how I've even personally maintained with the pandemic, shutting down and closing literally all religious buildings, church services. Now, yes, I know people are having church virtually, but it's just something to be in the presence of other, believers, congregations, and again, we know that, just when you get together, like we won't be able to get together for the ACAP conference. It's like a family reunion of sorts. We're able to feed off of each other. That energy is just great. And so we missed that. And so I had to remember that when it comes to my mental health, that I still have potential. I still have the ability to cope. I still got to work, and not just work. I got to do it fruitfully and productively. And then I can still make a contribution to this community. And so that's what I try to work with. I've been called upon to different congregations, in particular in the state of Michigan, where there have been so many people who have died. In the Church of God in Christ, we have lost 30 bishops, and bishops is one of the highest ranking positions. We've lost over 30 bishops in this 6-month span due to COVID-19. Now, everything may not, now again, I wasn't there to diagnose that everybody was coronavirus, but it's been within this 6-month period. And it's been tough. And so people have questioned their faith. They've questioned whether or not is God real, God is on their side. And people have even wanted to abandon their religion, spirituality. It's like, what is this? And so I've had to remind people, I had to remind myself that my faith is, if it's to remain strong, has to be tied into the true definition of what mental health is. It interlocks, intersects. And so when I point out to people, because some people think that mental health is so spooky, and when you say the word mental health, they get scared. But when you break it down to them, again, sort of World Health Organization, this is their definition. And you begin to think about how that impacts a person's ability to operate on a daily basis, and then how your faith, your religion, your spirituality should bolster those aspects of what true mental health is. That's what I've been able to emphasize, and that's what's been able to keep me going, even in the midst of the worst global healthcare crisis that we've ever faced.
Well, I want to say that I have been it has been an honor sharing with you, Jonathan, and Lisa, this experience today. And I want to finish with a quote of Abraham Heschel. He was one of the most important 20th century scholars in Judaism, and he escaped the Holocaust, and he was a strong influence in the civil rights movement. There are Andrew Young talks about having Rabbi Heschel's book, The Prophets, in his hand when he was, doing a lot of the marches, because he was so inspired by the work of Abraham Heschel. And he did march with Martin Luther King, and so he was an important part. So I'm gonna just put this quote in here. So Abraham Heschel, in one of his, I think, most important quote, he stated, "Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concerns one must feel for the suffering of human beings. That indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. That in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." We want to thank the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry to give us the opportunity to share our experiences and to have a contribution to our social dialogue. Thank you very much.